The year was 1888, and in the high valleys of the Colorado Territory, autumn did not arrive so much as it conquered. It was a swift, brutal campaign that drove the green from the aspens, replacing it with a fleeting, desperate gold before scouring the branches bare. For the handful of families settled in the basin, it was a time of frantic preparation, the air thick with the scent of pine smoke from curing meats and the rhythmic thud of axes splitting the last of the winter wood. But on the northern slope, where the valley narrowed into a tight throat of granite, Silas Thorne was engaged in a different sort of labor, one that earned him not the respect of his neighbors, but their deep and profound pity. He was building his cabin, but he was building it all wrong, wedging the nascent structure into a narrow cleft between two colossal, parallel fins of granite that jutted from the mountainside like the fossilized ribs of some ancient leviathan. Silas worked with a deliberate, unhurried pace that the others mistook for the slow-wittedness of grief. His wife, Eleanor, had been taken by a fever in the spring thaw, leaving him with their 8-year-old son, Thomas, and a silence in his life that was larger and colder than any coming winter. The community had expected him to move down into the main settlement, to take a smaller, more sensible plot where neighbors were a shout away. Instead, he had sold his prime meadowland and bought this worthless spine of rock, a place where the wind howled a meaner tune and the sun departed 2 hours early. Now, as the first snows dusted the highest peaks, his project was a source of constant, worried speculation. He was not building a cabin so much as he was building a coffin, they whispered among themselves, a strange timber and stone tomb for himself and the boy. The structure itself defied all known principles of sound construction, at least as they were understood in that valley. A proper cabin was built in the open, with 4 solid walls of notched timber, a deep stone hearth at its core to radiate heat, and a steep-pitched roof to shed the crushing weight of the snow. Silas's cabin had only 2 wooden walls, a front and a back. The sides were the raw, unyielding granite of the mountain itself. He had felled and stripped the pines himself, but instead of notching 4 corners, he was painstakingly scribing the end of each log to the uneven contours of the rock, fitting them against the stone with a watchmaker's precision. Most damning of all, there was no foundation for a fireplace, no great stone chimney rising through the roof. There was only a small, metal-ringed hole for a simple cookstove pipe, an entirely inadequate provision for the deep cold that could hold the valley in its grip for 5 solid months. Hiram Poole, a man whose own cabin was a model of frontier pragmatism, finally rode up one afternoon, unable to contain his concern any longer. He was a good man, a practical man, and he saw Silas's project not as an eccentricity, but as a dangerous folly that endangered a child. He found Silas on his knees, not praying, but meticulously packing a mixture of moss and clay into a hair-thin gap between a floor joist and the western rock face. Thomas sat nearby, carefully sorting pebbles by color. Hiram dismounted, his boots crunching on the granite scree. "Silas," he began, his voice devoid of judgment but heavy with purpose. "This won't do. A house needs to breathe. You seal it up this tight against the rock, the damp will get in. You'll have rot in the logs by Christmas and frost on your blankets every morning." Silas looked up, his face smudged with dirt, his eyes clear. He did not seem mad, merely occupied. "The rock will breathe for me, Hiram," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He turned back to his work, pressing the damp moss into the seam with a worn, wooden trowel. The answer was so nonsensical that Hiram could only blink. He tried another tack, gesturing with a gloved hand at the cabin's glaring omission. "And the heat?" That little stove won't keep a child from freezing when the real winds come. A man needs a hearth. A fire is the heart of a home in this country." Others had gathered behind him now, drawn by the spectacle. Dorothea Weiss, whose tongue was the valley's swiftest shuttle for news and rumor, watched with a sorrowful shake of her head, already composing the tragic tale for the next church social. "The mountain will be my hearth," Silas replied, again without looking up. This time, a murmur went through the small crowd. It was settled then. Poor Silas Thorne. The grief had unmoored him. He was speaking in riddles, placing his faith in stone and moss while ignoring the proven wisdom of generations. Hiram Poole sighed, a plume of white vapor in the frigid air. He had done his duty as a neighbor. There was nothing more to be said to a man who believed a mountain could warm him. He mounted his horse, gave a final pitying glance at the boy, and led the others away, leaving Silas to his strange, doomed task. They would bring charity when the winter truly hit, but they held no hope for the cabin. It was a folly, an aberration, a monument to a mind undone by sorrow. Silas heard their departure, the sound of hooves fading on the hard trail, but he felt no sting from their judgment. Their pity was a currency he had no use for. Their wisdom was sound, but it was incomplete. They saw the rock as a dead thing, a cold, damp obstacle to be overcome. He saw it as a vessel. He saw a battery. This knowledge had not come from any book of engineering, but from the calloused hands of his father. He had been a stonemason in Cornwall, a man whose life was a long conversation with granite. He had taught Silas that stone was not inert. It was a slow, patient creature with a vast and powerful memory. He remembered a day, years ago, when he was no older than Thomas was now. His father had been rebuilding a retaining wall on a sun-drenched southern coast. The day had been long and hot, the stones soaking in the summer glare until they were too hot to touch. Long after the sun had set and a cool sea mist had rolled in, his father had led him back to the wall. He had taken Silas's small hand and pressed it against the massive granite blocks. The air was chilly, but the stone was still profoundly warm, bleeding the day's heat back into the night. "Feel that, boy?" his father had whispered, his voice a low rumble. "That's the sun's long memory. Stone doesn't forget the heat. It holds it. It keeps it safe. Most men think a fire is what keeps you warm. A fire is quick and hungry. But stone is slow and generous." That was the principle. It was the secret knowledge that insulated him from the community's doubt. The two great fins of granite that formed the walls of his cabin had been absorbing the sun for 10,000 summers. The south-facing fin, in particular, was a colossal reservoir of thermal energy. It drank the high-altitude sun all day, every day, from the spring equinox to the autumn frost. The heat didn't just sit on the surface, it soaked deep into the rock, meters deep, a slow geological process of accumulation. The valley settlers saw the first snow and thought of winter, but Silas saw the mountain and thought of the stored memory of July. His cabin was not meant to generate heat, it was designed to capture it. It was a small, insulated bubble pressed against a vast, slow-leaking radiator. The wood, the moss, the clay, the triple-paned windows, they were all just gaskets, designed to stop that ancient, stored warmth from escaping into the cold. He had tried to explain it once, to Ruth Hartley, a woman whose quiet gaze held more curiosity than pity. She had asked him, gently, why he chose such a place. He had tried to find the words. "The rock," he'd said, gesturing to the sun-warmed southern face. "It's like a cistern. All summer the sun fills it. Now, in the cold, it will be full. The warmth will seep out all winter." He saw the flicker of incomprehension in her eyes. She was a kind woman, and she had nodded as if she understood, but he knew she had heard poetry, not physics. She thought he was speaking of the comfort of nature, a metaphor for strength. She had not understood that he meant it literally. The rock was a full cistern of heat, and he was simply putting his cup against the spigot. There was no way to explain it further without sounding like a madman, so he had let it go. Understanding was not a prerequisite for truth. The work was slow and arduous, a constant dialogue between his tools and the unforgiving stone. He had spent weeks just preparing the site, clearing away loose rock and leveling a narrow patch of ground for the floor. The two main timbers that formed the base of the front and back walls had to be perfectly scribed to the granite. This was not carpenter's work. It was a sculptor's. He would press the long pine log against the rock face, then use a small compass-like tool with a piece of charcoal to trace the stone's every bump and crevice onto the wood. Then came the painstaking process of carving, using an adze and a draw knife to remove the wood until the log fit against the stone as if it had grown there. Each log was a puzzle that took a full day to solve and shape. He sealed the join between wood and stone with a method his father had used for seawalls. First, he packed the larger voids with dried moss, which would compress and expand with the subtle shifts of the structure. Then, he mixed a thick slurry of clay and sand, forcing it deep into the remaining seams, creating an airtight, waterproof seal. Finally, he would melt pine pitch and paint it over the exterior of the seal, a black, resinous armor against the wind and melting snow. The front and back walls rose slowly, a testament to this meticulous process. They were only 10 feet across and 16 feet deep, a tiny footprint for a cabin. But the small size was intentional. A smaller space was easier for the slow, radiant heat of the rock to fill. For the roof, he laid heavy pine rafters, their ends nestled into pockets he had chiseled into the granite faces themselves. He laid thick planks over the rafters, followed by a layer of oiled hide he'd gotten in trade for his last pig. On top of that, he and Thomas spent a week laying sod bricks, cut from the one small patch of meadow on his property. The sod was thick with the roots of mountain grasses, a living blanket that would provide immense insulation. By the time the first serious snow arrived in late October, the cabin was enclosed. The door was a heavy, double-thick plank construction, insulated with wool from their own sheared sheep, and it closed with a satisfying, solid thud that sealed the world out. The two small windows, one on the front wall and one on the back, were his one extravagance. He had traded his wagon for them. They were triple-paned, a new and rare invention, with two sealed air gaps to prevent the precious warmth from bleeding out through the glass. From the outside, the cabin looked less like a home and more like a plug, a small, man-made object shoved into a crack in the mountain. The first real test came in the second week of November. An Arctic front, what the old-timers called a blue norther, descended upon the valley. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single afternoon. Smoke billowed thick and frantic from every chimney in the settlement as families stoked their fires, feeding cords of precious wood into the hungry hearths. At Silas's cabin, there was no plume of smoke, only the thin, occasional wisp from the cook stove when he heated their supper of beans and cornbread. Hiram Poole, watching from his own porch a mile down the valley, shook his head. "He'll be down here by morning," he said to his wife. "He'll have to be. No man can sit in a stone box in this cold without a proper fire." Inside the cabin, a strange quiet reigned. Thomas, who was used to the constant crackle and roar of a fireplace, found the silence unsettling at first. There was no focal point of heat, no glowing heart to the room. Instead, there was just an absence of cold. The air was cool, certainly, but it held none of a winter night's biting chill. Silas and Thomas wore their woolen sweaters and thick socks, but their breath did not mist in the air. The temperature hovered in a stable, livable equilibrium. It was the difference between the sharp, aggressive cold of the outside world and the passive, neutral coolness of a deep cellar. Silas lit a single lantern, its soft yellow light making the small space feel secure and intimate. He had to trust the principle now. There was nothing more to build, nothing more to seal. There was only the waiting. He ran his hands over the interior walls. The front and back walls, made of wood, were cool to the touch. But the granite walls were different. They were not warm, not in the way a heated stone by a fire is warm. They simply were not cold. They felt like the air itself, neutral and impassive. He pressed his ear to the southern rock face and could hear nothing but the faint, deep hum of the mountain. He was not merely living beside the rock. He was living within its thermal aura. His job now was one of maintenance and observation. Each morning he checked the seals, looking for any sign of frost ingress, any place where his careful work had failed. He found none. He tended his small cook stove with miserly care, using it only for meals. The brief blast of heat from the burning wood was a welcome addition, but he knew it was not their salvation. It was a temporary guest in a house warmed by a far older and more patient host. He explained to Thomas that they were living inside a giant, warm stone, like squirrels in the heart of an ancient tree, and the boy, accepting the simple logic of it, slept soundly through the nights under his wool blankets, untroubled by the cold that was laying siege to the world outside. The crucible came in January. A blizzard, born in the far north and fed by the moisture of the Great Plains, slammed into the Rockies with a fury that stunned even the most seasoned settlers. It was not just a snowstorm. It was a horizontal blizzard, a solid wall of white driven by winds that the old Ute tribes were said to have called mountain shapers. For 3 days and 3 nights, the world beyond the cabin ceased to exist. It was an apocalypse of wind and cold. In the main settlement, families were trapped in their homes, burning through their wood piles at an alarming rate, constantly battling the drafts that forced their way through the chinking of their cabins. The sound of the wind was a physical presence, a screaming banshee that threatened to tear the roofs from their rafters. But inside Silas Thorne's cabin, there was a profound and unnerving peace. The massive granite fins, which had funneled and amplified the wind before the cabin was built, now acted as a colossal windbreak. The storm raged over them, not at them. The sound was muted, a distant, high-pitched shriek rather than an immediate, violent roar. The snow piled in immense drifts against the front and back walls, but this was a blessing, not a curse. The snow was a natural insulator, and the drifts only served to further seal their small haven against the outside world. The temperature inside did not drop. It remained steady, a quiet defiance against the maelstrom. This was the moment of truth, the test of his father's words and his own conviction. On the second night of the storm, with the wind at its most violent, Silas performed a small ritual. He put out the lantern, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. He told Thomas to be perfectly still and listen. In the silence, they could feel it. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration in the rock walls, the resonance of the mountain resisting the wind. Then, he took the boy's hand and placed it on the south-facing granite wall. The stone was radiating a steady, gentle, and undeniable warmth. It was no longer neutral. The extreme cold outside had created a steeper thermal gradient, and the ancient heat stored deep within the rock was now flowing more perceptibly into the colder space of the cabin. It was a living warmth, the warmth of the earth's own body. It felt like placing a hand on the flank of a great, sleeping animal. In that moment, Silas felt a wave of quiet, unshakable triumph. The air was cool but breathable, entirely free of the smoke and stuffiness that would be filling the other cabins. Thomas, safe and warm, was not huddled near a fire. He was in the center of the room, feeling the life in the stone, his eyes wide with wonder in the dark. Silas understood then, in a way that transcended memory and theory. He had not built a house of wood with walls of stone. He had built a shelter within the embrace of a permanent, natural hearth. The mountain was not his enemy. It was his partner. It was the repository of seasons, the keeper of the sun's long memory. Every doubt he had faced, every pitying glance from his neighbors, dissolved in the face of this simple, profound, sensory proof. He had not conquered the winter. He had simply stepped aside and let the mountain do it for him. He had listened to a deeper wisdom, and it had kept him and his son safe. The wind could howl, and the temperature could fall to impossible depths. It did not matter. They were no longer on the mountain. They were in it. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, the valley was an alien landscape, a sea of white sculpted into fantastic shapes by the wind. The silence was as stunning as the noise had been. From the chimneys in the settlement below, no smoke rose. The people were running low on wood, conserving what they had left, trapped by drifts that buried their doors. A deep worry settled over the valley for the man and his boy up in the granite cleft. They were presumed lost, frozen in their foolish, fireless home. Hiram Poole, his own woodpile dangerously low, and his family chilled despite a constantly roaring fire, felt a heavy weight of guilt. He had seen the folly, but had not been forceful enough to stop it. Bundling himself in every layer he owned, he strapped on his snowshoes, determined to dig them out, to perform the grim duty of a neighbor. The journey was a brutal 2-hour struggle through chest-deep drifts. As he approached the cleft, he saw that the cabin was almost entirely buried, only a small portion of its sod roof and the very top of the back wall visible. There was no sign of life. His heart sank. He made his way to the front, expecting to find the door blocked by a mountain of snow. He found it buried, but as he began to dig, he heard a sound from within, the scrape of a shovel. A few minutes later, the top of the door was cleared from the inside, and it swung open. Silas Thorne stood there, holding a shovel. He was not frostbitten. He was not shivering. He wore a simple wool sweater, his cheeks flushed with the effort of digging. Behind him, in the lantern-lit interior, Hiram saw Thomas playing on the floor with his colored pebbles. A wave of air washed out from the cabin, and to Hiram's utter astonishment, it was not the frigid, dead air of a tomb. It was cool, but it was alive. It was breathable. It was unbelievably, impossibly not frozen. "Silas?" Hiram stammered, his mind refusing to process what his senses were telling him. You're all right." Silas nodded. "We're fine, Hiram. Come in. You look half frozen." He stepped back, and Hiram, moving like a man in a dream, entered the cabin. The difference was immediate and shocking. Outside, the world was a crystalline hell of absolute zero. Inside, it was a sanctuary. He took off his glove, and with a trembling hand, did the one thing that could confirm or deny the miracle. He placed his bare palm against the granite wall. It was not warm like a hearthstone, but it was pulsing with a latent, undeniable energy, a complete absence of the deathly cold that should have been radiating from it. He felt the sun's long memory. He looked from the stone to Silas, his face a mask of awe and shattered certainty. "My God, Silas," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. It's warm." That spring, a procession of men made their way up the trail to Silas's cabin. They did not come bearing charity or pity. They came with notebooks and questions, with the humbled curiosity of men who had seen their most fundamental beliefs overturned. Hiram Poole was at their head. Silas, patient and without a trace of triumphalism, explained it all again. He spoke of his father, of the thermal mass of granite, of the sun's stored energy, of sealing the envelope, of letting the mountain do the work. This time, they did not hear the ramblings of a grieving madman. They heard the clear, practical wisdom of an innovator. They put their own hands on the stone walls and felt the truth of it for themselves. Over the next decade, the architecture of that high valley began to change. No one ever replicated Silas's cabin exactly. The granite fins were a unique feature of his land, but the principle was adopted and adapted. Men began to build their homes stone-backed, with one wall set deep into a south-facing hillside. They paid more attention to insulation, to sealing the gaps, to understanding that a house was not just a shield from the weather, but a system for managing energy. Silas Thorne, the quiet widower, became an unlikely sage, a man whose counsel was sought on the placement of a new home or the construction of a root cellar. He never claimed any special genius. He only said that he had listened to what the stone had to tell him. His cabin stood for nearly 100 years, sheltering 3 generations of his family before it was finally retired. A local landmark known as the Summer House, it became a story told to children, a testament to the quiet man who, in the depths of his grief, had looked past the conventional wisdom of his time and found a way to heat his home not with fire, but with the long, slow, and generous memory of the sun.